Hi everybody, and welcome to our latest episode of the eGPlearning Podblast. I'm Hussein Gandhi, GP in Nottingham.
I'm Dr. Andrew Foster, GP in Nottingham as well, GP partner, interested in working at scale and technology and how that can make our lives and patients' lives better.
Yeah. So we're Andy and Gandhi from the eGPlearning Podblast, and today we're going to talk to you about AI. It's been in the news lately and we wanted to have an interesting discussion about it and how its implications may affect us in primary care and actually in the wider scope in terms of how that works for patients and clinicians in detail. So I hope you enjoy the episode today.
Good. It's probably worth starting out with a shout out to our regular listeners. We've had some retweets on Twitter, quite a few this time, so we're going to acknowledge people in the show notes. Keep listening, keep retweeting, keep promoting the podcast. Thank you very much.
And always, if you're interested in following what we're doing, feel free to subscribe to us on our podcast. So we're both on iTunes and Podbean, where we host it. But you can also listen to us on SoundCloud as well as YouTube. So feel free. So, Andy, what have you been up to?
So been dealing with a lot of work at the practice recently, Gandhi. But something interesting that did happen is we hosted Norris MP for North Nottingham, our patient participation group, and he works with Labour on their health strategy. So I was actually quite impressed, quite informed, aware of recruitment issues, aware of lots of issues around general practice and health. So that was fun. But how about you, Gandhi? Been up to anything interesting?
So a couple of interesting things. First of all, I'd like to thank all our listeners and my followers for nominating me and thankfully electing me as National RCGP Council Rep. So I'll be taking up post in November of this year for a 3-year term. I hope I continue to represent you and your views. And as always, I openly ask that anyone can challenge me and contact me in terms of how I can do that better. Additionally, I kind of reached a small milestone in my head with the eGPlearning page and group that I've been running. So my page has now got to 200 followers, which I know sounds small, but for me that's a big thing, and I'm quite proud of it. And I wanted to thank all of my followers on the page and stuff.
Yeah, that's a big milestone. Exponential growth from here. So next up.
Interesting you say that. In the past 3 months, we've gone from 100 to 200, whereas the first year took me to get to 100. So it is growing. It's growing quickly, which is nice to know.
Fantastic.
And with that, if you are interested in following the work I do on eGPlearning about using technology to enhance primary care and its learning, feel free to follow, as well as on my new kind of invention, Tip Thursday. So every Thursday I hope to release some interesting little tidbits and information for you to use in your clinical practice, and hopefully you'll find that useful.
Fantastic. Hashtag Tip Thursday then.
Definitely.
Great.
You've already picked it for me, Andy.
So Gandhi, we're talking about AI today, and There's been another AI story in the news this week, I think with our old friend Babylon Health. What's been happening there?
So a fairly big release that came out just last week. So Babylon, the tech company that has prioritised in terms of doing a lot of video conferencing access and that kind of stuff, and well considered probably the market leader in this, has debuted its AI product. So this is a product which basically looks at information submitted by patients. And the key thing that came out of this is they claim that this is as good as a doctor. So when they ranked it in terms of informational knowledge, things like the AKT exam for our GPs, so for those that aren't, it's the applied knowledge test that is used by GP trainees to figure out how good they are and whether they can go on to become GPs. They've used similar questions from that subset and basically said that the outcomes of the AI is that it can function as good as, if not slightly better than a GP at that.
They've made some interesting claims. I'm just looking at the figures here. Mm-hmm. So they say that their AI scored 81%, and the average mark for a GP trainee is 72%, which is interesting and looks good on paper. Mm-hmm. But of course, that's just handling information and not handling patients. So I'm wondering, it's a little bit misleading, but.
Well, as always, everything's in the headlines. You need to read the text. I think one of the interesting things about it is it is evaluating risk. I think that's what the AI is very good at, and it looks at the information that's presented to it and uses that to evaluate it, and uses an element of AI to then figure out how that works and delivering an outcome. And it delivers that outcome in risk percentages. So it tells you you've got potentially an 80% risk of this condition and a 70% risk of this condition, and uses that to then hopefully come to an outcome in terms of what kind of you may need. You're right, there's questions of how it gets to that decision, so in terms of learning that information, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how AI can do that in a bit, but it's definitely an interesting thing. But I think, first and foremost, we probably should talk about what AI is. So can you fill us in, Andy?
Yeah, so AI, and particularly AI within the context of healthcare, is described as the use of algorithms and software to approximate human cognition in the analysis of complex medical data. Specifically, AI is the ability for computer algorithms to approximate conclusions without direct human input. So that's the definition.
So what does that mean in English?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth probably going through a few kind of key definitions and some of the terminology around AI just before we embark on our journey today. Mm-hmm. I think when you look at films and in the media, what a lot of people might think of as AI is what is termed artificial general intelligence. Mm-hmm. So that's your HAL 2000 or your short circuit. So that's something that really talks and behaves and thinks like a human. But actually, that's recognised that's probably quite a long way off. Okay. But some of the technologies which are powering the AI revolution at the moment are things like so there's logic and rule-based AI, which is actually something that's been around for quite a long time. So this is where the designers of the system provide the computer with all the rules from the beginning that allow it to do a function that might otherwise be done by a human being. Quite simple technology by today's standards, but can be quite powerful. So if you have some software that automates your tax return, that's the sort of thing it's doing. Quite good where figures are involved, data that computers are used to dealing with. And we probably already see this around in prescription safety software that pops up on a daily basis in our GP surgeries, and flagging of abnormal investigation results and attaching information to investigation results, things like that.
So potential examples are things like our risk scores that we use in very basic format, and extracting that information from the patient record to present that to us as clinicians at how we use it. So really basic ones would be things like the fever pain score or the FRAX scores, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Q risk.
Yeah, and then like you said, slightly more intricate would be the intelligent prescribing, so that the systems that tell us the relative risk of using one drug versus another and the interactions and that kind of stuff and how that plays. And obviously there are more advanced versions, things like OptimizeRz and that kind of stuff. So
yeah, so and actually whilst it's still quite simple, there's probably a long way for that to run, and there's a lot more that could do to help us. So that's one example of AI. Other types of AI, perhaps the more sexy sort of modern types that grab the headlines, things like machine learning. And Gandhi, do you want to tell us a little bit about machine learning?
So for our listeners, if you remember, we had a talk with John Brassey about a month or two ago, and we talked about his kind of unique thing, which was Tripdatabase, which he describes as the Google of evidence-based medicine. And in that episode, we actually covered what machine learning was to a degree. So it's how it uses the information subsets and learns from the way that people use things to produce a more intricate outcome, shall we say. So as a result of that, it looks at the evidence, ranks the evidence itself, and it evaluates it, and then produces that as an outcome to give you the information in a more detailed format. So definitely recommend having a listen to that episode if you're more interested in machine learning with evidence-based medicine. But how it works, and it's using algorithms and connections and that kind of stuff, and then taking that further to present an information option that you can then use as a clinician potentially.
Yeah, and I think the key thing that seems to drive a lot of these machine learning algorithms is the need for data and the right type of data, and data sets for it to use to learn. And so I gather part of the technique is that you present it with a lot of data where the outcome's known. It looks at that, makes the connections, learns from it, and then it reaches a stage where you can give it novel, new data, and it can draw its own conclusions and hopefully do that in a reliable and safe manner. Yeah.
And that's different, I guess, then to deep learning, which is...
Well, deep learning is another one of those phrases around, and my impression is, again, we're not experts, but my impression is that actually that's the technology that powers a lot of the machine learning. So this deep learning is sort of synonymous or based around this neural network technology that people talk about. So that's based on the idea of neurons in nature. So it's where connections are made between different pieces of information, and those connections can strengthen or wither in response to the data. So you see this in things like Google's map of the internet, in facial recognition software. So Facebook's getting very good at tagging me and my friends, and potentially pets in photos. I think actually Google bought DeepMind, didn't they? A British company that's quite experienced in this field. And I gather they were using this on patient records at Royal Free in London, and they got in a bit of trouble for not seeking appropriate permissions and handling that data in the appropriate ways. We'll probably link to a story about that in the show notes. That's just interesting how companies can get in deep water with these things.
And that does raise one of the issues with AI, which we'll cover towards the end.
Definitely. And then just a few other phrases to throw in there as natural language processing. So the interesting thing about this is AI needs data really to teach itself on. And at the moment, the way humans interact with computers is quite clunky. You have to learn to type on a keyboard, you have to operate a mouse. Touch screens are quite new, but even that is the human bending to the way the computer wants to get the information. So computers from that era, they're not getting a lot of information. Humans have to specifically input it. Once something like natural language processing is properly cracked, and they're really getting there at the moment, then the computers can learn from humans, or listen, can get data about how humans really interact with one another. Basically, once that's cracked, there's potentially an explosion in the amount of data available for them to learn, for the AIs to learn on, and there might be an explosion in their application and how effective they are.
And I guess one example of that is things like Google Translate. So many people potentially have used this, and you always kind of wonder why it's better at some languages than others. Well, an interesting way of looking at that. So, for example, the EU obviously has a lot of translation elements in terms of negotiating and people talking to each other and stuff, and all that information is stored. And what Google have actually done, they've had access to that because it is open access in terms of the translation aspect of it. And that's one of the reasons why Google Translate works really well with European languages, because it's got that massive data set that you can actually use. And that's why it's better when it comes to compared to other languages which don't have as many data sets for it to rank against. But it is learning. So recently, Google unveiled their new Google Assistant about a month or so ago, I think it was. And it was an interesting demonstration because they didn't tell people in the audience what was happening. And they were, I believe, it was booking a hairdresser's appointment, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So Google Assistant, I think it may have been mocked up, but Google Assistant rang up and booked a hairdressing assistant on behalf of a client. And they'd integrated lots of ums and ahs and pauses, and it really did behave like a human. They're learning a lot over at Google about natural language processing and speech.
Exactly. So the key issue there, that supposedly a lot of the people in the audience didn't realise that the person they were speaking to on the other end of the phone was actually a computer. They actually believed it was a genuine person.
It spooks a lot of people, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
I think they subsequently said that the AI will identify itself as Google AI in future, but they had to sort of scramble to deal with unexpected bad press around that.
And I guess then the question of how does this apply to us in primary care? Well, there are some applications already doing this. So if you look at dictation software, particularly market leaders of people like Dragon, Lexicon Echo and Dictate.IT, they use these kind of algorithms to learn how you talk to then process that better, so it leads into a dictation outcome in terms of what you're trying to say and pass that on. But these are systems that learn as time goes on. Out of the box, they may not be the perfect solution that works, but as you continue to use them, the AI software built within them develops and then makes it more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the final technology worth mentioning, there are many more, of course, is this computer vision as well. So bit like the natural language issues, teaching computers to see the world in a similar way to humans unlocks an awful lot of data, a lot of training data, and potentially puts a lot of human functions in the hands of computers as well. You're probably all aware that there's work going on in terms of radiology and assessing radiology films and images and automating that with AI. Again, lots of data set for that. Lots of images out there. Lots of images where there is a written report for it as well. So it's really prime territory for machine learning. It's got all of those features. Similarly, dermatology images as well.
We mentioned that, one application is also retinal imaging, which there's huge amounts of data set because, for example, if you're a diabetic patient, you'll have regular retinal monitoring, general populace, that kind of stuff. So that information is out there. And, if you were to Google retinal images, you will see thousands upon thousands of images with information about what they are. So then potentially, our fellow colleagues over at Cupris, who we've talked about in previous episodes about their technology and stuff, could potentially look at exploring AI in terms of their ophthalmoscope and otoscope technologies, and using that as an outcome to try and improve ENT and ophthalmology referrals.
Yeah, it's great. I think a lot of companies will be exploring these ideas. So a lot of that sounds quite positive around the technologies and around some of the applications that we're beginning to see.
So then, Andy, we talked about the benefits. What's the problems?
Well, people do worry about AI. There's lots of things people might worry about. To highlight some of the classic ones, there's this problem which sometimes people call the black box problem. So with neural networks and that kind of machine learning, often the computer will reach a conclusion about what a certain set of data means, but there's no way of knowing why that is.
Okay.
And when you're actually suggesting treatments and asking people to make decisions, our patients will often ask us why. They don't just want to know the what. They want to understand how we've reached that conclusion, and we should be explaining that. And often it is impossible to know why a computer has reached a certain conclusion, which is interesting and presents a problem.
And I guess one of the other ones that we talked about was the bias in data sets. So some of you may have come across this in news stories about a year or so ago. Microsoft created its own little chatbot that learnt human behaviour from monitoring Twitter.
Twitter, obviously that's the best example of humanity, of course.
Exactly.
So Gandhi, I'm sure this turned into a very polite, nice chatbot. I'm sure that's what happened.
Yeah, so although the chatbot was called Tay, it's probably better to call it Hal, maybe, from our 2001 Odyssey friend. But yeah, effectively the chatbot became quite obnoxious, a little bit rude, and to the point where effectively Microsoft had to pull the chatbot.
Racist, evil, threatening, and so they had to. Microsoft had to can it or pull the plug. Or Tay's gone. So, but an interesting lesson there. What you put in matters. And I suppose an implication for us in medicine is if we think about how we've arrived upon our normal ranges for blood tests, and that's largely based on a data set many years ago around a Caucasian population. And we know that doesn't necessarily apply to some of our patients. Some of our patients have lower neutrophil count, white cell count, if they're from certain ethnic backgrounds, and we have to make an adjustment for that. That's something that we know about, but with this black box issue, not knowing what the thinking is behind the conclusions, who knows if we're teaching on the wrong sort of data, then we might end up with all sorts of unpredictable bias outcomes. So interesting.
And I guess then the other one that I think concerns us a little bit more is the whole element of liability and risk management. So who's actually responsible for the outcomes of the AI itself? Is it the AI and the company that derives it? Or is it the clinician that's then using the AI outcome itself? And that's the question of what happens at that point. So, if it goes wrong, if the AI gives the wrong advice, for example, where's the liability, where's the responsibility? And, as clinicians, for us, there's other implications. How does that affect things like indemnity? How does that affect things in terms of complaints and those unfortunate negative things that do happen in our working day? They are considerations that we need to be aware of.
And so, Gandhi, where do you think the risk should lie?
The fourth area of risk that we've talked about is obviously the biggest, which we alluded to earlier. So data security and privacy. This is obviously a big buzz area right now, clearly following GDPR in particular. And if you want to know more about GDPR, feel free to listen to our episode a couple of months ago.
I'm also thinking my personal experience from the last episode, the genomics episode, where my genetic data is now stored somewhere in the US with the potential to be shared with law enforcement. The correct handling of data and getting the privacy policies and security right is really
I can assure you, our listeners, Andy is actually very terrified about the fact that he may never be allowed into America at this moment in time.
Who knows? So there's those sort of potential problems, and people also worry about employment issues and what this might do to the wider economy, which we'll probably touch base on a little bit at the end. But first, I'm just going to throw some questions over to Gandhi. We might throw some questions back and forth. So how do you think AI might change general practice? What's the implications for us?
So I think it is actually a game changer, if I'm being honest. I think the way that we are seeing the potential applications, I think we're going to see a lot of things rapidly change, because one of the things we know about knowledge in our world is rapidly expanding, and we're learning, knowledge doubles every 3 years, apparently, at the current rate it's going. So in terms of how we use the data, it's going to adapt and change, and I think it's going to have a massive implication in the way that we work. Partly because this is actually, public driven. The public want access to these kind of resources and services because they see it in their daily life. We're seeing it in Facebook, we're seeing it in Google, we're seeing it in Amazon. And people are saying, well, why can't I have that similar level of application in other areas like health? So I do actually think this, along with things like telecommunications, like video consultations and that kind of stuff, is going to change the way that we have to approach healthcare. Is that a good change? Well, people used to say computers were the worst thing in the world for medicine 20 years ago. Now, if you ask me to do a consultation without my PC or my computer, I'd be horrified. In fact, it's the fastest way to get people to stress levels of DEFCON 5 in a practice.
Yeah, we had a power cut the other day and we had to go back to pen and paper. And it was very debilitating, very debilitating. And people used to talk about computers getting in the way of the relationship between patients. But actually, that's where I put my little cues about, little things that people have told me. And, I can demonstrate a much better relationship and understanding of patients when I've got my notes than compared to when they realise that I don't really remember all that much about them in between. This is what I remember.
So I think short term it's going to make clinicians change the way that they do things. How it's going to do that, I think we're still at very early stages, and then there's clearly some people that will say that this is going to revolutionise everything, and there's other people that are saying it's the naysay and the doomsday of everything that we hold dear to our working lives and stuff. But I think ultimately change is going to happen.
But what?
Well, I think one interesting
Yeah.
thing to look at. So Babylon, as the initial company that's come out with this, has created this AI system that they say can evaluate information given by a patient and come to an outcome. And they are potentially going to look at how they can use that to manage access and demand, I would imagine, because that's the obvious thing to tackle in our current healthcare system.
Yeah, there's a need there. There's a product there, isn't there?
So if that system was able to manage the health outcomes for 30% of consultations, imagine how much time that would spare up for us to actually spend with patients. The patients that actually have the more complex things or more complex issues and that kind of stuff. So potentially, there is some really positive work there.
I think so. I would just say about Babylon, they sometimes get a bad press, but they're a world-leading British company that seems to be signing up partnerships with Samsung mobile phones. Going to be installed on every new Samsung phone. They've got a partnership with China. They're potential to be a real British champion as well and change medicine. So whilst sometimes might disparage them, they do seem to be shaping up to be a world beating company potentially.
And that potentially may be some of the aspects of the fact that the NHS and particularly the people working in the NHS have always had a bit of resistance to change, and that may be purely out of change fatigue. If you work with the NHS, you will know that it changes on a near hourly basis at this moment in time. So it's not unexpected that many people are struggling with accepting more change, particularly seismic change like this.
Does the Babylon app run on Internet Explorer 8?
I don't think so, Andy. Does anything run on Internet Explorer 8 at the moment?
The notice information system for logging into NUH hospitals. And anyway, So I mean, I'm just thinking of some other areas where it might change things. I'm quite excited about AI working together with human clinicians, and actually they say, what's the best sort of chess player in the world? Is it a person? Is it the computer? Well, the computer beats the person. Yeah. But a person working or a team of people working together with AI will beat an AI and will beat humans. So there's lots to say that humans and computers have complementary skills. Definitely.
And I guess one example that I can think of, so in terms of tools that use AI to have a better outcome, so there's a company out there called Stethee. that has created a new form of stethoscope that they feel is revolutionary. And I think it's probably a little bit early to say that, but they claim that the AI technology that backs onto the audio technology that it uses can provide a more clearer outcome in terms of sound, but also it processes what it hears to actually tell you what the problem is. So rather than you having to work out, is this a murmur, is this a heart rhythm, it can actually process that using the technology itself to say this is actually what the potential causes of it are, and it relays that, and it can be shared and stuff. And is slightly more advanced than some of the other electronic stethoscope kind of equipments out there. It's still early days, and whether it does what it says it can do is, I don't know. I'm by no means tried it or anything like that, but it is one of these things that I've read about. And
it sounds really interesting. Maybe if they're listening, they can send us a demonstration model and we'll review it.
I'm sure we'd be happy to review it for them and give them our perspective from a primary care element and the British perspective, because they obviously are an American.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm quite excited about, looking forward to, is potentially having some support within the consultation as well as a GP. It's an AI sat over my shoulder in a nice way, or on the computer screen, that's perhaps got some awareness of the context of the consultation, where I'm at with the patient, and can present me with useful information, risks, guidelines, to guide me to make sure that what I'm doing is appropriate. Give me some protection, with perhaps me in the driving seat still, but having that support there. I think there's a big opportunity there for improving the quality of care, the consistency across different practitioners, different doctors, and the safety of care. So I'm quite excited about that.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I'm always reminded of, and what I tell my trainees, guidelines, they're not tram lines. And part of the reason for that is we have a multitude of guidelines. So we talk about NICE, SIGN, British Heart Foundation, all these other kind of guidelines that we have. But they are very much for single disease issues. There's very few that look at actually multimorbidity, which is our biggest challenge in healthcare in terms of delivery for the future. So therefore, evaluating which one do you prioritise, that's where the skill of a true GP comes into play, because it's taking obviously the patient's derived outcomes, what they want, and all that holistic element of things, and jumbling it all up and coming out with an outcome that is the best for the patient as a whole. And potentially AI has the ability to reason some of that a lot more effectively, because it's got more processing ability to present and extract all those various different guidelines into one, what is the best way of looking at it and that kind of stuff. And that's a challenging thing for a GP to figure out. Often it could take us a while to reason a lot of that information and figure it out. Often that's gut instinct, if I'm being honest, more than anything. But it'd be interesting to see whether the systems can provide that support.
Yeah, exciting times on the horizon, I guess. I suppose it's worth mentioning that AI will affect other areas and other parts of the healthcare industry and society at large that will then impact on our jobs as general practitioners as well. Yeah. Are they going to play a greater role in care homes, supporting people to live in their own homes, affecting social care? There's going to be an impact on medical research, perhaps better treatments, more rapid development and deployment of treatments and medical devices. So I think that's really exciting too. One of the things, Gandhi, that people always worry about when we start talking about AI, or when anybody starts talking about AI, is the impact on the labour market. What's your thoughts about the threat to GPs' jobs, nurses' jobs?
So to explain this, I'm actually going to give you an example from a film I watched recently. So some of you may have watched the film Hidden Figures. So this is a film about NASA, and several years ago they used to have computers, not in the sense of a Dell or an IBM computer. We're talking people that used to provide all the calculations that NASA used to use to figure out trajectories, to figure out where landing pods would end up and that kind of stuff. And the film, first of all, I would highly recommend watching it. It's an excellent piece of acting and story and everything else, and a true story that's been made into a cinematography masterpiece, if I'm being honest. The main character is Katherine Johnson, who's played by Taraji Henson, and she plays a character who is unbelievably brilliant, and effectively can do maths that I could not even dream of doing, and as a result of that is one of these computers. And one of the points I remember is towards the end of the film, one of the astronauts who's trying to come back to Earth, it's one of the Apollo missions, and I can't remember which one, they're not sure whether they should do what they need to do, and they can't work out the calculations. And they were meant to have this beautiful, amazing, brand spanking new IBM computer that could do the calculations, and it just wasn't felt to be reliable. And again, I can't remember the exact reason. So they ended up going back to the person. And the reason was the astronaut said at the time that I'd rather trust a face I can see than a computer that I can't. So that's one element of healthcare and jobs in particular with AI. Sometimes people do like having that person in front of them.
And I can see a real role there for knowledgeable humans like GPs being an interface between a trusted interface between AI, particularly for complicated morbidity, very serious illness, definitely. But there's other parts of the story.
There is another part. So one of the other characters, which was Octavia Spencer, who plays Dorothy Vaughan. So she plays a character that is basically in charge of the computers. These ladies that can do all these calculations and stuff. And her real drive throughout the film that you can see is the fact that she wants to maintain both her job and the job of the people working with her. And she recognises that this new IBM computer that's come in is basically going to make them all lose their jobs. And in terms of evaluating that, she recognised that she has to learn the language of the computer. And what she ends up becoming is the person that is the one that runs it, because she's the only person that knows about it. So all the people at NASA didn't think about how to use the computer and what it means if it breaks down and all that kind of stuff. She recognised that, she learnt it, and she's the one that therefore becomes in charge. And she taught all the people who works with her how to do that, so in a sense maintain their jobs, but did it in a sense by maintaining the technology that was meant to actually replace them.
Mm. So they saw what was coming and changed and upgraded their skill set, so that they could use the technology that was doing the job they were doing better. So, gosh, there's a real message potentially for healthcare professionals there, isn't there?
Yeah. Unfortunately, as we said, change is something that is inevitable in the NHS, and either you stick your head in the sand or you go with the flow. Yeah.
And I suppose people talk about this threat to jobs from an AI, and people sort of look back to the past and say, well, actually, there have been industrial revolutions before. People used to, lots of people used to till the soil, and then, there was an agricultural revolution, or many agricultural revolutions, and now we have tractors and automated farming. And actually, people have moved on to other jobs. That's the agricultural revolution meant that we could support larger cities. People work city jobs now. So there's this argument that things always change, things always move on, there's always new challenges. However, some people say, well, actually, what's happened before, the same thing's just happened again. It's been about replacing human labour, things that humans do physically, and it's the first time ever that we're going to be replacing human thought. Will it be the same again or not? My feeling is, I think it will be the same again. I think humans will learn new skills. These new things the new technologies will create whole new industries, whole new ways of delivering health, and there'll be a whole set of new jobs and roles for us to move into. So I'm an optimist. Are you an optimist, Gandhi?
I am. I think it clearly has opportunities. There are some definite risks and some definite negatives, I think, out there as well. But on the balance of things, this is something that's coming. In my view, it's something that's definitely going to hit. Play in the way that we work with patients and play in the way that we deliver healthcare. So I think from a GP perspective, it's something that you need to at least be aware of. Potentially something you need to adapt with rather than against. It'd be lovely to say that, and I know there are many people out there that will say that, you can't replace a face-to-face GP. You're right. You can't replace a GP at the end of the day, because we are the best trained people in terms of what we do and how we do it. But that doesn't mean that we can't have further support.
Yeah, and also people might want more GPs. There's some of our functions that can be duplicated and provided.
If you can find them, Andy, that is obviously one of our biggest challenges right now. Finding another GP is, gold dust. Mentioning it, but
come and work at the practice. Yeah,
definitely.
So interesting. Gandhi, you doing anything to prepare yourself for this fourth industrial revolution, the AI revolution? How are you preparing yourself and your practice?
So at the moment, probably not a great deal, but I think, this is one of these things that's going to change and adapt. And I think being aware of what's out there. Interestingly, I'm doing some work around looking at telemedicine and how that may play for local practices and trying to provide a system that means that we can actually have that function for our patients in a different model. So, I think people need to be aware of it, people need to adapt, and people need to move with it to a degree.
So that's embracing it, yeah. I think for me, I think the focus is on making sure that you have the right skills going forward. So I think some of the skills which have been at a premium in white collar jobs, I'm doing my inverted commas fingers here, and healthcare professionals are one of them, are perhaps things that will be duplicated and replicated by machines in the same way that physical labour has been in the past. Things but we should focus on things which are harder for computers to do, and that's that element of human understanding, relationships, difficult communication, and also those areas of being creative, innovating services and approaches. Those are the sorts of areas where I think humans will still have a premium. So that's what we think about AI in healthcare. There's a lot more of a conversation to be had. We're very interested to hear what people might think out there as well. So let us know. Is it the great white future? Is it a negative thing? Are we at maximum hype and actually it's not going to deliver anywhere near what we think? Tell us how you feel. Gandhi, how can they communicate with us?
So you can contact us either on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. We're on almost every media platform you can think of. So if you want to contact myself directly, it's at Dr. Gandalf52 or at eGPlearning on Twitter, or obviously the Facebook page is at eGPlearning. If you type that in, you will find us without any difficulty whatsoever.
And I'm at Dr. A.W. Foster. So contact me on Twitter as well. So it feels like that's a wrap for today. It's been really interesting talking about AI in healthcare. Thank you everyone for listening. Do subscribe and follow. Gandhi, how can they do that?
So if you're looking to listen to this podcast ongoing, definitely subscribe to us. Again, we're on iTunes and Podbean are our main platforms, but we're also on SoundCloud and YouTube. So those people that want to watch us but not watchers, if that makes sense. And in addition, one of the things we would say, normally we do cover a variety of apps and things for you to listen to, and I know some of our listeners love listening to that section. We apologise for not doing that today. We felt that we needed to dedicate quite a bit of time to AI. It's a very meaty subject and one that we really want. We've been thinking about covering this for a while, and we've got some future plans with how that may work with things like Alexa and Google Home in the future coming for you. So stay tuned for that. We'll be back to form in terms of reviewing apps and stuff next time for you guys.
Okay, so fantastic. Thanks for listening, and it's goodbye from Andy
and Gandhi. See you later. Bye.
Bye.